On the evening of November 8th, 1983, a 57-year-old janitor named Frank Kowalski was mopping the hallway outside room 214 of Jefferson High School in McLean, Virginia, when he noticed something that would set off a chain of events involving two intelligence agencies, three diplomatic incidents, and what came dangerously close to becoming an international crisis during one of the tensest periods of the Cold War. What Frank found wasn't a bomb or a hidden microphone or anything that Hollywood might have prepared him to recognize as espionage equipment. It was a book, a physics textbook, left on a classroom windowsill, open to a page that had been annotated in the margins with what looked like mathematical formulas that didn't belong there. Most people would have closed the book, put it back on a shelf, and thought nothing of it. Frank Kowalski did exactly that. But 20 minutes later, as he was emptying trash bins in the same hallway, he paused, returned to room 214, and took another look. And that second look, that moment of curiosity from a man whose formal education had ended at the 10th grade, but who had spent 4 years as a radio operator in the Pacific during World War II, would trigger a series of events that neither the CIA nor the KGB had planned for, wanted, or knew how to control once it started. To understand how a janitor with a mop and a physics textbook could create an intelligence crisis, you need to understand what was happening in McLean, Virginia in the fall of 1983 and why a suburban high school had become, without anyone's knowledge or intent, a communication node in an active espionage operation. McLean sat just outside Washington, D.C., close enough to the Capitol that its residents included State Department officials, Pentagon analysts, intelligence officers, and the various lawyers, contractors, and administrators who kept the machinery of government running. CIA headquarters at Langley was less than 3 miles from Jefferson High School. The Soviet embassy was about 8 miles away in the other direction. And in between were neighborhoods where Americans and Soviets, who worked in various official capacities, lived in a kind of cold peace, shopping at the same grocery stores, driving the same roads, existing in proximity without ever quite acknowledging the fundamental opposition that defined their professional lives. Jefferson High School had approximately 1,800 students in 1983, and among them was a 16-year-old junior named Peter Volkov, whose father Dmitry worked as a cultural attaché at the Soviet embassy. Dmitry Volkov was not actually a cultural attaché. He was a KGB officer operating under diplomatic cover, which was standard practice during the Cold War. Every major embassy had intelligence officers posing as diplomats, and everyone knew it, but the fiction was maintained because it allowed both sides to conduct certain kinds of espionage while preserving the diplomatic framework that prevented the rivalry from spiraling into open conflict. Peter Volkov attended Jefferson High School because that was what the children of diplomatic personnel did. They went to American schools, learned English, experienced American culture, and generally tried to have something resembling a normal adolescence despite the unusual circumstances of their parents' work. By all accounts, Peter was a quiet, academically serious student who excelled in mathematics and physics, kept mostly to himself, and showed no interest in the intelligence work that consumed his father's life. He had a few friends, mostly other children of foreign diplomats or military families who understood what it was like to move frequently and exist somewhat outside the mainstream of American teenage culture. He ate lunch in the cafeteria, played chess in the school's chess club, and did his homework in the library like thousands of other students. What Peter didn't know, what his father had been very careful never to tell him, was that he was being used as an unwitting courier in a communication system that connected Dmitry Volkov with a source inside the U.S. government. The source, whose identity would become one of the most closely guarded secrets of the investigation that followed, had access to classified information that the KGB wanted. But direct communication between the source and Dmitry Volkov was impossible. Volkov, like all Soviet embassy personnel, was under constant FBI surveillance. His phone was tapped, his mail was opened and photographed, his movements were tracked. Any contact with an American who wasn't part of his official duties would be noticed, investigated, and likely result in both parties being exposed. So the KGB had developed a different method, one that exploited the fact that Peter Volkov attended an American high school and that high schools are inherently chaotic environments where people come and go, where books and papers and belongings get mixed up and misplaced, and where no one pays much attention to what students are reading or writing in the margins of their textbooks. The system worked like this. The source, who had some connection to Jefferson High School, whether as a parent, a substitute teacher, or someone with legitimate reason to be in the building, would identify which textbook Peter Volkov was currently using for his physics class. This wasn't difficult. The school used a standard curriculum, and Peter's class schedule was a matter of public record available through normal school channels. On a predetermined day, while Peter was at lunch or in another class, the source would access room 214, find Peter's physics textbook, and write a coded message in the margins of a specific page. The message would be disguised as mathematical notations, the kind of work a student might do while trying to solve a problem, nothing that would look suspicious to a casual observer. That afternoon, Peter would return to class, gather his books at the end of the day, and take the textbook home, completely unaware that it now contained classified information. At home, Dmitry Volkov would wait until Peter was doing his homework, would casually look over his son's shoulder the way many parents do, and would see the annotated page. He would memorize the message or photograph it quickly while Peter was in the bathroom or getting a snack, and then Peter would return to his homework, never knowing that anything unusual had occurred. The next day, Peter would take the book back to school. The annotations would be erased or covered over during class as he used the book for its intended purpose, and the cycle would continue. It was an elegant system precisely because it required no direct contact between the source and the handler, no suspicious meetings, no encrypted radio transmissions, no dead drops in parks that might be under surveillance. It exploited the mundane reality of high school life, the fact that students carry textbooks back and forth every day, and the fact that no intelligence agency in 1983 was seriously considering the possibility that a teenager's physics homework might be a vehicle for classified information. The system had been operating successfully for approximately 7 months by November 1983, and it might have continued indefinitely if Frank Kowalski hadn't been the kind of person who noticed when things didn't quite fit the pattern. Frank had been working as a janitor at Jefferson High School for 6 years. Before that, he'd held various jobs: mechanic, security guard, night watchman at a warehouse, the kind of work available to a man with limited formal education but a strong work ethic and a willingness to do whatever was necessary to support his family. He was a veteran, having served in the Navy during World War II, and though he rarely talked about his service, it had left him with certain habits of observation and attention to detail that never quite went away. During the war, he'd been trained as a radio operator, which meant he'd spent hundreds of hours listening to coded transmissions, recognizing patterns in static and signal, understanding that information could be hidden in ways that weren't immediately obvious. That training had been 40 years ago, but some things, once learned, become part of how you see the world. On the evening of November 8th, Frank was working his usual shift, which ran from 3:30 p.m. when school let out until around 11 p.m. when the building was cleaned and secured for the night. He'd been mopping the second-floor hallway, working his way past the science classrooms, when he entered room 214 to empty the trash and wipe down the desks. The physics textbook was on the windowsill, left behind by a student who'd probably realized it was missing only after getting home. Frank picked it up, intending to put it on the teacher's desk where lost items were usually collected, and it fell open to a page that had been heavily annotated in the margins. This wasn't unusual. Students wrote in textbooks all the time, despite rules against it. Notes, doodles, answers to problems. But something about these particular annotations caught Frank's attention. They were too neat, too systematic. The handwriting was small and precise, nothing like the scrawled notes most students left. And the formulas themselves, while they looked mathematical, didn't quite match the content on the page. Frank had no formal training in physics, but he'd seen enough student work over 6 years to recognize what study notes generally looked like. These didn't look like study notes. They looked like something else. He put the book on the teacher's desk and continued his work, but the annotations bothered him in a way he couldn't quite articulate. There was a pattern to them, a structure that reminded him of something from his time in the Navy, from those long nights listening to coded transmissions where information was hidden inside what looked like random noise. He finished cleaning room 214, moved on to the next classroom, emptied more trash bins, mopped more floors, but 20 minutes later, he went back. He told himself he was being ridiculous, that he was seeing patterns where none existed, that this was just a student's homework and he should leave it alone. But he picked up the book anyway, opened it to the annotated page, and looked more carefully. The formulas were written in groups of 5 digits, with small notations between them that could have been mathematical operators, but that if you looked at them differently, if you remembered how certain military codes were structured, could also be something else entirely. Coordinate markers, possibly, or timestamps, or indicators pointing to specific letters and specific words on the page. Frank Kowalski stood in that empty classroom, holding a physics textbook, and made a decision that would have been easier to dismiss as paranoia if the year had been different. But this was 1983, a year when Cold War tensions had escalated to levels not seen since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Soviet forces had shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007 in September, killing 269 people, including a U.S. congressman, after the civilian airliner strayed into Soviet airspace. President Reagan had called the Soviet Union an evil empire earlier that year. NATO was conducting Able Archer 83, a military exercise that simulated nuclear war. And Soviet intelligence was so convinced this might be cover for an actual first strike that they'd put their forces on high alert. The world felt closer to nuclear conflict than it had in decades, and Frank Kowalski, standing in a high school classroom in McLean, Virginia, was looking at annotations in a physics textbook that his instincts, honed 40 years earlier in a very different war, told him were not what they appeared to be. The question was what to do about it. He could report it to the principal, but report what exactly? That a textbook had notes in the margins that looked suspicious? The principal would think he was crazy. He could call the police, but the police would ask him what crime had been committed, and he'd have no answer. A student had written in a textbook. That wasn't a crime. It wasn't even particularly unusual. He could do nothing, put the book back, forget about it, go home to his wife in his small house in Springfield, and never think about it again. That would be the sensible thing, the reasonable thing, the thing that wouldn't make him look like a paranoid old man seeing spies under every desk. But Frank had fought in a war where carelessness got people killed, where ignoring your instincts because they seemed irrational was often the difference between survival and disaster. And his instincts were telling him this mattered. He made a phone call from the school's main office, using the number for the FBI's Washington field office that was listed in the phone book. He got a duty officer, explained that he worked at a high school in McLean and had found something that might be related to espionage, tried to convey that yes, he was serious, and no, this wasn't a prank, and waited to see if anyone would take him seriously. The duty officer, a young agent named Christopher Lang, who had been with the Bureau for less than 2 years and who was working the night shift precisely because he was junior enough that he got stuck with the assignments no one else wanted, took Frank's information with professional courtesy and internal skepticism. The FBI received dozens of tips every week from citizens who thought they'd discovered evidence of spying or terrorism or various other threats to national security. 99% of these tips led nowhere. They were misunderstandings, paranoia, bored people looking for excitement, or genuine confusion about normal activities that seemed suspicious to those unfamiliar with how intelligence work actually operated. But Christopher Lang had been trained to take every report seriously, to gather information, to ask the right questions, and to pass credible leads up the chain of command. He asked Frank Kowalski to describe exactly what he'd found, where he'd found it, and why he thought it was significant. Frank explained about the textbook, about the annotations, about the way they were structured, and why they reminded him of military codes from World War II. He gave the name of the school, the room number, the fact that the book had been left on a windowsill. He answered every question patiently. aware that he probably sounded like exactly the kind of person the FBI ignored, but determined to report what he'd seen because the alternative, doing nothing, felt wrong in a way he couldn't ignore. Lang thanked him, took down his contact information, and said someone would follow up if necessary. Then he hung up and filed a report that would normally have been reviewed in a few days, added to a database, and likely never acted upon. Except that Christopher Lang's supervisor, when he reviewed the report the next morning, noticed three details that made him pause. First, Jefferson High School was in McLean, less than 3 miles from CIA headquarters. Second, the school had a significant population of students whose parents were foreign diplomats, including Soviet diplomats. Third, and most importantly, the FBI's counterintelligence division had been actively investigating suspected information leaks from several government agencies, and one of their working theories was that the KGB had developed a new communication method that didn't rely on traditional dead drops or electronic transmissions. The supervisor, a man named Gerald Morrison, who had been with the FBI for 23 years and had worked Soviet counterintelligence since the early 1960s, had learned to pay attention when multiple unusual factors converged in a single report: a janitor finding coded messages in a high school textbook at a school attended by Soviet diplomats' children during a period of suspected active espionage was exactly the kind of improbable detail that might actually be significant. Morrison assigned 2 agents to follow up with Frank Kowalski that same day. They arrived at Jefferson High School on the afternoon of November 9th, identified themselves to the principal, and requested to speak with Frank privately. They asked him to show them the textbook, to walk them through exactly what he'd noticed and why he thought it was significant. Frank did so, aware that these 2 agents in their dark suits and serious expressions were evaluating not just the evidence, but him, trying to determine whether he was credible or delusional. He showed them the annotations, explained about his Navy service, about his experience with radio codes, about the way these particular markings didn't quite fit the pattern of normal student notes. The agents photographed every page of the textbook, documented exactly where it had been found, and asked Frank not to discuss this with anyone, including the school administration, until they'd completed their investigation. What followed was a rapid escalation that surprised everyone involved, including the FBI agents who'd expected this to be another dead-end lead. The photographs of the annotated pages were sent to FBI cryptanalysis specialists who confirmed within 6 hours that the annotations were indeed a code, not a sophisticated code, not something that would take weeks to break, but a relatively simple substitution cipher that used the text on the page as a key. The numbers in the annotations corresponded to words in the textbook, and when properly decoded, they spelled out a message that contained information about classified Defense Department procurement schedules, specifically regarding satellite communication systems. This was not public information. This was intelligence that would be valuable to Soviet military planners, and its presence in a high school textbook suggested an active espionage operation using a communication method the FBI had never encountered before. The investigation expanded immediately. FBI agents identified the textbook as belonging to Peter Volkov, son of Soviet Embassy Cultural Attaché Dmitry Volkov. They pulled surveillance files on Dmitry Volkov and confirmed that he was suspected of being KGB, but had never been caught in any compromising activities. They began emergency surveillance of the Volkov family, monitoring their home, tracking their movements, trying to identify who had placed the coded message in Peter's textbook. They interviewed teachers at Jefferson High School, asking carefully vague questions about who had access to classrooms, who might have been in room 214 when students weren't present. They pulled visitor logs, substitute teacher records, parent volunteer lists, trying to identify anyone connected to the school who also had access to classified Defense Department information. Meanwhile, the CIA became involved because the information in the coded message related to intelligence systems that fell under their purview. And when the CIA gets involved in a domestic counterintelligence investigation, things become complicated very quickly because the CIA and FBI have overlapping but distinct jurisdictions, different institutional cultures, and a long history of friction over who gets to run operations on American soil. A joint task force was established, meetings were held, strategies were debated. The unanimous decision was that they couldn't simply arrest Dmitry Volkov. He had diplomatic immunity. The most they could do was declare him persona non grata and expel him from the country, which would solve the immediate problem but wouldn't identify the source who was providing the information. The source was the real prize, the person who had betrayed their country, who had access to classified materials and was passing them to a hostile foreign power. Finding that person was the priority. The plan that emerged from these discussions was to use Peter Volkov's textbook as bait. The FBI would allow the communication system to continue operating, but they would control what information passed through it. They would feed false intelligence through the textbook, carefully crafted disinformation that seemed valuable but was actually designed to mislead Soviet analysts. And they would watch to see who accessed Room 214, who had the opportunity to write coded messages in Peter's textbook. Surveillance teams were positioned throughout Jefferson High School. Hidden cameras were installed in Room 214, and agents posing as substitute teachers, maintenance workers, and even students' parents began circulating through the building, all watching for anyone who showed unusual interest in a physics textbook on a classroom windowsill. But here's where Frank Kowalski's initial discovery created a problem that no one had anticipated. The KGB, professional and careful, had their own security protocols. One of those protocols was to never use the same communication method for too long. Another was to watch for signs that a method had been compromised. The textbook system had been operating for 7 months, which was approaching the limit of how long they considered any single method safe. And Dmitry Volkov, experienced intelligence officer that he was, had noticed something that made him uneasy. On November 9th, the day after Frank found the textbook, Peter had mentioned at dinner that one of the janitors had been in room 214 when he'd gone back to retrieve a book he'd forgotten. Nothing unusual. Janitors cleaned the classrooms every day. But Peter had noticed because the janitor had been looking at a textbook on the teacher's desk, which seemed odd because janitors didn't usually pay attention to books. It was the kind of small detail that most people would dismiss, but Dmitry Volkov was trained not to dismiss small details. He asked Peter which book it had been. Peter said he thought it was a physics textbook, though he wasn't certain. That was enough. Dmitry Volkov had operated successfully for years because he knew when to be paranoid, when to assume the worst, when to shut down an operation rather than risk exposure. A janitor paying attention to a physics textbook could mean nothing, or it could mean the communication method had been compromised. The smart play, the professional play, was to assume compromise and cease all operations using that method immediately. Dmitry Volkov made the decision that night. No more messages through Peter's textbook. The method was burned, and they would need to develop something new. What Dmitry Volkov didn't know was that the FBI was now watching him so closely that his decision to shut down the textbook system was itself observed and interpreted as confirmation that the system had indeed been an espionage communication method. When no new coded messages appeared in Peter's textbook over the next week, when FBI surveillance noted that Dmitry Volkov had become noticeably more cautious in his movements, when the source, whoever they were, presumably received some signal to cease using the textbook method, the FBI concluded that their investigation had been detected. This created a dilemma. They had confirmed that an espionage operation existed, but they hadn't identified the source. And now that the operation had been disrupted, the source would likely go dormant, making them even harder to find. The CIA's response to this situation was to push for immediate action. They wanted Dmitry Volkov expelled from the country as a deterrent and a public demonstration that Soviet espionage operations would not be tolerated. The FBI argued for patience, for continued surveillance, for waiting to see if the source would attempt to re-establish communication through some other method. The debate went up to the National Security Council, where officials were already dealing with the heightened tensions of Able Archer 83 and the ongoing fallout from the Korean airliner incident. The last thing anyone wanted was another confrontation with the Soviet Union. But the presence of an active spy network operating through a high school textbook, was exactly the kind of thing that could become a major embarrassment if it leaked to the press before it was resolved. The decision was made to expel Dmitry Volkov, but to do it quietly through diplomatic channels, as part of a routine rotation of embassy personnel that wouldn't attract media attention. The Soviets would be informed that certain individuals were no longer welcome. They would lodge the standard protests, and everyone would move on. It was the kind of compromise solution that satisfied no one, but avoided escalating an already tense situation. Except that the Soviets, when informed through back channels that Dmitry Volkov was being expelled, made a counterproposal that caught American officials off guard. They would remove Volkov voluntarily as part of a routine personnel change, which would allow both sides to save face. But in exchange, they wanted assurances that there would be no public revelation of the textbook communication method, and they wanted the United States to remove one of their own intelligence officers from the American embassy in Moscow, a quid pro quo that would maintain the balance of espionage operations and prevent either side from claiming a propaganda victory. This is where the situation escalated, from a contained counterintelligence investigation into something approaching a genuine diplomatic standoff. The CIA officer in Moscow, whom the Soviets wanted expelled, was running several valuable operations, including at least one source inside the Soviet military who was providing critical intelligence about Soviet nuclear capabilities. Removing this officer would compromise those operations and potentially endanger the sources. The CIA refused. The Soviets responded by indicating that if their terms weren't met, they would make the textbook incident public, framing it as an example of CIA harassment of innocent Soviet diplomatic families and their children. They would put Peter Volkov in front of cameras, a teenage student being targeted by American intelligence simply because of his father's nationality. It would be excellent propaganda at a time when both sides were accusing each other of escalating tensions. The standoff continued through late November and into early December 1983. Negotiations happened through intelligence liaison channels, with both sides making threats and counteroffers, neither willing to back down completely. The FBI continued investigating, trying desperately to identify the source before the situation resolved itself and the trail went completely cold. They interviewed dozens of people connected to Jefferson High School, ran background checks on anyone with access to classified information who also had children at the school or any other connection to the building. They found nothing conclusive, though they developed several theories about possible suspects. Meanwhile, Frank Kowalski returned to work each evening, mopping floors and emptying trash bins, aware that something he'd done had triggered events far beyond his understanding or control, but never told exactly what those events were. FBI agents had instructed him to continue his normal routine, to watch for anything else unusual, but not to discuss the textbook incident with anyone. So he didn't. He cleaned classrooms, including room 214, and tried not to think about the fact that his decision to take a second look at some annotations in a textbook had apparently set off some kind of crisis between intelligence agencies. The resolution, when it finally came in mid-December, was neither dramatic nor particularly satisfying to anyone involved. The Soviets quietly transferred Dmitry Volkov back to Moscow in what was officially described as a routine rotation of embassy personnel. The Americans did not expel their CIA officer from Moscow, but they did agree to reduce intelligence collection activities targeted at Soviet diplomatic personnel in the United States for a temporary period. Both sides agreed not to publicize the textbook incident, and both sides claimed privately to their respective leadership that they had achieved their objectives. The source who had been passing information to Dmitry Volkov was never definitively identified. The FBI developed a strong suspect, a mid-level Defense Department analyst whose daughter had attended Jefferson High School and who had access to exactly the kind of information that had appeared in the coded messages. But they never gathered enough evidence to make an arrest, and the investigation was eventually classified and shelved, remaining there for decades. Peter Volkov returned to the Soviet Union with his family, and presumably had no idea that he'd been used as an unwitting courier in an espionage operation. Jefferson High School continued operating normally, with students and teachers largely unaware that anything unusual had happened. The physics textbook in question was quietly removed from circulation by the FBI and placed in an evidence storage facility where it remains to this day, a footnote in the voluminous files of Cold War counterintelligence operations. Frank Kowalski worked at Jefferson High School for another 8 years before retiring in 1991, the same year the Soviet Union collapsed and the Cold War officially ended. He never spoke publicly about the textbook incident, and when journalists occasionally tried to track down details about various espionage cases from the 1980s, his name never appeared in connection with any of them. The FBI had kept his identity classified to protect him from potential retaliation and because his continued employment at the school had been useful during the investigation's active phase. By the time the case was partially declassified in the late 1990s, under Freedom of Information Act requests filed by Cold War historians, most of the names had been redacted, including Frank's. The incident appeared in the declassified documents as a case study in how civilians could inadvertently discover intelligence operations, but without enough identifying details to determine where or when it had actually occurred. The question of whether Frank Kowalski had actually prevented espionage or simply disrupted an operation that would have been discovered eventually through other means is one that intelligence professionals might debate. What's clear is that his decision to trust his instincts, to look twice at something that seemed off, to make a phone call that could easily have been dismissed as paranoid, had consequences that rippled through multiple intelligence agencies and nearly triggered a significant diplomatic incident during one of the most dangerous periods of the Cold War. Whether those consequences were positive or negative depends on perspective. The FBI failed to identify the source, which meant a traitor remained free, but the communication method was disrupted, which meant classified information stopped flowing to the KGB, at least through that particular channel. The textbook method itself, once exposed, was never used again by Soviet intelligence, at least not in any way that American counterintelligence detected. It had been elegant in its simplicity, exploiting the everyday routines of school life in a way that was nearly impossible to detect without someone like Frank Kowalski noticing that annotations in a textbook didn't quite fit the pattern. After the incident, FBI counterintelligence briefings began, including warnings about seemingly innocuous communication methods that exploited civilian infrastructure, and high schools with significant populations of diplomats' children received additional security scrutiny, though without being told exactly why. For Frank Kowalski, life returned to normal, or as normal as it could be, after accidentally triggering an international intelligence crisis. He continued mopping floors, cleaning classrooms, emptying trash bins. He never received any formal recognition for what he'd done, because formal recognition would have required acknowledging what had happened, which neither the FBI nor the CIA wanted to do. There was no medal, no commendation, no thank you letter from the director of the FBI, just instructions to never discuss what he'd found, and a quiet awareness that sometimes paying attention to details that don't quite fit can matter more than anyone expects. In the classified file on the textbook incident, buried in storage at FBI headquarters, there's a final memo written by Gerald Morrison, the supervisor who had authorized the initial follow-up with Frank Kowalski. The memo, dated December 28, 1983, after the immediate crisis had passed, summarizes the investigation and its outcomes. In the last paragraph, Morrison notes that the case demonstrates the ongoing value of civilian vigilance and the importance of taking seriously reports from individuals with relevant experience, even when those reports seem implausible. He specifically mentions that Frank Kowalski's Navy service and experience with coded transmissions had given him pattern recognition skills that trained counterintelligence professionals had overlooked. The memo recommends that FBI field offices maintain better protocols for evaluating tips from veterans who might recognize operational security indicators that seem irrelevant to those without military backgrounds. Whether anyone actually implemented that recommendation is unknown. What is known is that Frank Kowalski, a janitor with a 10th grade education and 4 years of wartime service as a radio operator, saw something that hundreds of other people, students, teachers, administrators, and even FBI agents conducting general security reviews, had looked at without seeing. He saw it because his experience had taught him to recognize patterns that didn't belong, and he trusted that recognition enough to make a phone call that most people would have dismissed as foolish. And for a few weeks in late 1983, that phone call created exactly the kind of crisis that Cold War intelligence operations were designed to avoid. A moment when the hidden war of espionage and counter-espionage threatened to become visible, public, and uncontrollable. The textbook remained on the windowsill in room 214 for less than 24 hours. The annotations that Frank Kowalski noticed had been written by someone whose identity remains classified. The information they contained came from someone who had betrayed their country for reasons that were never fully understood. And the consequences of Frank's decision to look twice, to trust his instincts, to make that phone call, rippled through intelligence agencies on both sides of the Iron Curtain, in ways that he would never fully know, which is perhaps appropriate, because the nature of intelligence work during the Cold War was that most people involved in it, whether professional officers or accidental participants, never saw the complete picture, never knew how their actions fit into the larger pattern, never received confirmation that what they'd done had mattered. Frank Kowalski died in 2003 at the age of 77. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his Navy service during World War II and his long career as a school janitor. It mentioned his wife of 53 years, his 3 children, his 7 grandchildren. It mentioned his membership in the local VFW post and his volunteer work with the community center. It did not mention physics textbooks, coded messages, or the time he accidentally triggered a CIA KGB standoff, because those details remain classified long after his death, and probably will remain classified for decades more, until everyone involved is gone, and the secrets of that particular moment in the Cold War can be discussed without endangering sources, methods, or the people who found themselves caught in the machinery of intelligence operations. Through nothing more than chance and curiosity,